Welcome, everybody, to the Body, Soul, and Spirit podcast. I hope you're having a wonderful, wonderful day and that you have a wonderful week. I want to start out this week talking about bitterness. And it's so significant for us to discuss this because when you look at bitterness and what it does neurologically to your brain, it has such an impact in certain parts of your brain. And oftentimes when you think of bitterness, it's not something that overwhelms us immediately or all at once. It's something that begins to grow a little here and a little there until it finally becomes this huge growth that can actually affect your physical body. It affects your brain. It affects your neural pathways. It affects, physically speaking, parts of your body that can cause ailments and sicknesses. And sometimes we don't realize that bitterness is growing. And I want to talk about how it begins to grow. How does it start? Bitterness usually starts to take root in some form in our thoughts. And typically those thoughts are negative. It's negative thoughts about another person. And those kinds of negative thoughts can be sour, sharp, very distrusting of a person, cynical. It could be a bad attitude towards somebody and very cynical towards someone that maybe hurt you or you feel has offended you or has wronged you, or perhaps they have. And when a root is not immediately removed or those thoughts are not dealt with, those distortions cognitively are not dealt with, uprooted, if you will, removed quickly, that bitterness will begin to grow and grow. And what happens when you think of it in terms of agriculture, that bitterness begins to grow full-blown like a tree. And it produces fruit. The fruit is bitterness, wounds. Now you're scornful, hurtful. And now when people come near you, they're eating of that fruit. There's different ways to detect if I have bitterness inside of our soul. There's ways to detect if there's bitterness growing in your thoughts. One way to find out is to ask yourself this question: am I replaying it over and over in my mind? A conversation that you had with somebody, a situation that you had with somebody. It's like you rehash things. It's like replaying the tape. Something that bitterness does is it always grows in the soil of justification. We justify ourselves. We make excuses for why we can keep that bitterness. When you find yourself playing a tape over and over and over again, that's got to be a big sign that some root is trying to take effect inside of your thoughts. When you think about a particular person, a particular group, a particular family maybe, you find yourself speaking really bad. You're critical, cynical. Why is there such a need to speak so dangerously about that particular person? And what does that reveal about you? Maybe God's been trying to deal with you about an attitude towards somebody. And if we don't get honest with ourselves, we are never going to become whole that way. We have to honestly admit if there's some form of unforgiveness, some form of bitterness that's affected maybe our thoughts now. And one thing that you will find is that bitterness affects joy. We're no longer joyful. It's like we're sad. We could be bothered, frustrated, and it's almost like the joy of life, the luster of life is eaten up. And it's difficult to be joyful and positive. Instead, there's negative thoughts about that particular person. And you're hounded by them, by these thoughts. They're hassling thoughts. And it's important for you to recognize it in order to be free of it. Here's another question. Is out of your mouth coming out maybe some rude comments, critical comments, cursing comments, murmuring comments, degrading, even defamation of character, slandering, gossiping? Those are all signs that bitterness is taking root, that bitterness is growing. It's growing as quickly as the weeds outside our front lawn. Have you ever noticed you are out in the front and there's no appearance of a weed, but all of a sudden, the next day you go back out and there's this weed and you say, where did it come from? Bitterness is like that. It springs up quite quickly and it shows up in our conversations. It shows up in our thoughts. It's what we speak. You can be in a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden you change the conversation to speak about that particular person again. And typically it's a defamation of character. You're angry. You want to destroy that person. Or maybe you're not that far, but you slander it. You know, bitterness, it's been told that bitterness can affect you physically speaking. Dr. Carson Roch, he studied bitterness for about 15 years. He was a psychologist, and he said when you harbor for a long time bitterness, it may forecast patterns of biological dysregulation. And biological dysregulation is really a physiological impairment. It affects your metabolism. It affects your immune system and even your response to those immune systems. You can't lose weight. The levels of immunity, right, are low. That's why you get sick often. It can even lead to organ dysfunction and even physical diseases. Scientists have found that when bitterness goes undetected, it always affects, even in men, the hormonal system. It affects immune system. And most people that carry bitterness typically can have high blood pressure and even heart diseases. This is more serious than we thought. I want you to think about the things that maybe you think about when it comes to other people. Have we not forgiven? And another question we want to ask ourselves is, my friends and those that surround me, do you find that they're also quite bitter? See, every good gardener knows that you just can't chop a weed off. You have to yank them up from the root, because if you don't, it's going to spring up again. There's a famous quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it goes like this: forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a constant attitude. It's not a feeling. It's a constant attitude. Think about what you think about over and over again. Ask yourself these questions. Am I pretending like I'm okay? Am I having a hard time forgiving people or others or a particular person? Are you experiencing anger towards a particular person? Or now you've become petty about things? Do you make snip remarks? Is there passive aggressive text messages? It's almost like you're desperate to make them understand how you feel. Or there's probably memories that haunt you, and it's time to get a new memory. Sometimes when there's bitterness, it could be compulsive. It shows up in our compulsiveness. You maybe are compulsive when it comes to certain activities because they're distracting you from getting to the root of problems. This is another question to ask yourself. Are you not taking responsibility for your feelings? That it's easier to blame that person. We have to take responsibility for our own emotions and our own feelings. And maybe you're blaming somebody else. When you choose to hold on to that root of bitterness and that offense and that unforgiveness, what you're saying to the one that hurt you is, I hold you responsible, not just for what you did to me, but how I reacted and responded to what you did. I hold you responsible for my unhappiness. Now, when you put it that way, it makes us reflect that we cannot hold anybody responsible for our unhappiness, because bitterness makes us unhappy. If you've ever seen somebody that maybe is unhappy and they just aren't joyful, it's probably because at the heart, something's going on in their thoughts. Is there bitterness? Joy is robbed from our daily activity. We can't enjoy the little things. We don't look at life from a full glass, from a positive aspect. We look at the glass half empty. We look at what someone did, their actions and their responses. When you think of it physically, it's making us sick, withholding these things inside of us. It's really a good check, because we never want it to lead us to affect our physical body. When we hold on to these roots like unforgiveness and bitterness, it's actually making you sick. And it could cause high levels of stress, like anxiety, that will lead us to anxiety, that will lead us to depression or high blood pressure. I think it's time for us to have some forgiveness therapy, bitterness therapy, and choose to let go. You may ask, well, how do I do that? It's easier said than done. Oftentimes our hurt and our pain and the offense seems to be so much heavier and greater than our desire to be free. And the first thing I would say to you is, it's a choice. It's a choice of will. It's an attitude to be able to say, this is not worth this physical sickness. This is not worth it to carry that, to hold on to this bitterness and lead me to all of these ailments. It's not worth it. To rob me of joy, it's not worth it. To make me sour and cynical, it isn't worth it. I don't want to hold anybody responsible for my actions, my unhappiness. It's time to let go.